The monthly howling ceremony was supposed to be a celebration of pack unity, a time when every voice joined together in a harmony that could be heard for miles. Across the Silverstone territory, for most wolves, it was a moment of pride, a chance to showcase the strength and power that flowed through their supernatural bloodline. For Luna Greystone, it was 3 hours of carefully orchestrated humiliation that reminded everyone present why she was considered the weakest Omega in pack history. She stood at the very back of the assembled pack, positioned behind even the newest members and youngest pups, her designated place in the hierarchy that everyone understood without question. At 19, she should have been coming into her full power. Her howl should have been growing stronger with each passing ceremony. Instead, it seemed to grow weaker, more pathetic, a sound that barely qualified as a whisper compared to the magnificent voices that surrounded her. "Remember, Luna," whispered Beta Marcus Ironwood, pausing beside her as he made his way to the front ranks where the pack's elite would lead the ceremony. "Try to actually make a sound this time. Last month's performance was so quiet that some people wondered if you'd forgotten how to howl altogether." The casual cruelty in his voice was worse than outright anger would have been. Marcus wasn't even trying to be malicious. He genuinely seemed to believe that his criticism was helpful, that somehow pointing out her failures would motivate her to miraculous improvement. It was the kind of thoughtless dismissal that had defined her entire life in the Silverstone pack. Luna's throat tightened with familiar shame as she nodded silently, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to respond. Around her, she could hear other pack members sharing similar advice, their words carrying the weight of disappointed expectations and barely concealed frustration. "Maybe if she practiced more," suggested Sarah Moonwhisper, though her tone implied she doubted. "Practice would help someone with Luna's obvious deficiencies. My grandmother always said that Omega voices could be strengthened with proper training and dedication. Some wolves are just born weak," replied Thomas Stormclaw with the casual certainty of someone who had never questioned his own advantages. "No amount of training can fix a fundamental lack of power. At least she tries, which is more than some Omegas manage." The backhanded compliment stung worse than an outright insult would have. Luna had been trying her entire life, had spent countless hours alone in the forest attempting to strengthen her voice through practice and determination, but no matter how hard she worked, no matter how desperately she wanted to contribute something meaningful to her pack's ceremonies, her howl remained a thin, reedy sound that barely carried beyond her own lips. Alpha Derek Silverstone took his position at the front of the gathering, his massive frame radiating the kind of natural authority that had kept their pack safe and prosperous for over a decade. When he lifted his head toward the full moon that hung like a silver coin against the star-scattered sky, every wolf present fell into respectful silence. "Tonight we gather as one pack, one family, one voice," he intoned, his words carrying the weight of tradition that stretched back centuries. "Let our howl carry across the land, proclaiming our strength to any who would challenge us, our unity to those who would divide us, and our pride to the moon goddess who watches over us all." The Alpha's howl began as it always did, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to emerge from the very earth beneath their feet. It was a voice that spoke of ancient power, of bloodlines that had ruled these mountains since before humans learned to build cities. One by one, the other pack members joined their voices to his, creating a tapestry of sound that was both beautiful and terrible in its raw supernatural force. The betas added their strength to the Alpha's foundation, their voices weaving complex harmonies that spoke of loyalty and strategic brilliance. The Gammas contributed notes of fierce protection and unwavering courage, while the Deltas provided the steady, reliable tones that held the entire composition together. Even the youngest pups managed creditable howls that carried the promise of power yet to come. And then there was Luna, standing at the back of the pack, opening her mouth to add her voice to the ceremony, and producing a sound so weak, so pathetic, that it was immediately swallowed by the magnificent chorus around her. She might as well have been mute for all the contribution her howl made to the pack's declaration of strength. The worst part wasn't the weakness of her voice, though that was humiliating enough. The worst part was the way the ceremony continued, as if she wasn't even there, as if her presence or absence made no difference whatsoever to the pack's ability to project power and unity. She was invisible in the most painful way possible, present but not participating, included but not valued. As the howl reached its crescendo and began to fade, Luna caught sight of movement at the edge of the clearing. 3 figures had emerged from the forest during the ceremony, their presence going unnoticed by the rest of the pack, who were still caught up in the euphoria of their collective voice. But Luna, positioned at the back and feeling disconnected from the celebration, was the first to spot the strangers. Even in the moonlight, she could tell these weren't ordinary wolves. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of supernatural power, far beyond anything she had ever encountered, and their very presence seemed to make the air around them shimmer with barely contained energy. The one in the center was particularly striking, tall and broad-shouldered, with an aura of command that made Alpha Derek's authority seem like a pale imitation. As the pack's howl finally died away and wolves began to disperse back to their homes, the strangers stepped into the clearing's light. The effect on the assembled pack was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, laughter died in throats, and even the youngest pups seemed to sense that something momentous was happening. Alpha Derek Silverstone, the central figure, called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing despite its conversational tone. "I am Kai Stormrine, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. I come seeking audience with your pack, specifically with one whose voice I heard during your ceremony, Alpha King." The words sent shock waves through the gathered wolves, who had never expected to see royalty in their remote mountain territory. Luna felt her knees go weak as she realized she was in the presence of the most powerful werewolf in the known world, a figure whose very existence was the stuff of legends. "Your Majesty," Alpha Derek stammered, dropping to one knee in a gesture of submission that was echoed by every other pack member present. "You honor us with your presence. How may the Silverstone pack serve you?" King Kai's eyes swept over the kneeling wolves, his expression unreadable as he studied each face in turn. When his gaze reached Luna, still standing frozen at the back of the group, something shifted in his features, recognition, perhaps, or satisfaction at finding what he had been searching for. "Rise," he commanded, and the pack obeyed as one. "I seek the Omega whose howl called to me across the mountains. A voice unlike any I have heard in my 3 centuries of existence. One that speaks not of power or dominance, but of something far more rare and precious." Confused murmurs rippled through the pack as wolves tried to understand what the Alpha King could possibly mean. Luna felt her heart hammering against her ribs as a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. "Your Majesty," Alpha Derek said carefully, "I'm not sure which Omega you're referring to. We have several in our pack, though none with particularly noteworthy voices." King Kai smiled, and the expression transformed his stern features into something almost gentle. "The one standing at the back of your gathering, the one whose howl carries the music of the moon goddess herself, though she seems unaware of her own gift." Every head in the clearing turned toward Luna, and she felt the weight of their collective stare like a physical force pressing against her chest. This couldn't be happening. There had to be some mistake, some confusion that would be cleared up once the Alpha King realized his error. But as those ancient, powerful eyes met hers across the clearing, Luna saw something in them that took her breath away. Not the dismissal or pity she was accustomed to seeing, but recognition and something that looked remarkably like reverence. "You," King Kai said, his voice gentle but carrying absolute authority. "Come forward, Omega. It's time the world learned to hear the true beauty of your voice." Subscribe to our channel to discover what incredible secrets lie hidden in Luna's supposedly weak howl. Why has the most powerful Alpha King in existence traveled across kingdoms just to hear her voice? Don't miss the next chapter where everything Luna thought she knew about herself will be turned upside down. Hit that subscribe button now. Luna's legs felt like water as she made her way through the parting crowd of pack members, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion to barely concealed resentment. She had spent 19 years being invisible, being overlooked, being dismissed as the weakest member of their community. Now, suddenly, she was the center of attention in the most terrifying way possible. called forward by royalty for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. "Your Majesty," she whispered when she finally reached the space in front of King Kai, her voice barely audible even in the sudden silence that had fallen over the gathering. "I think there's been some mistake. My howl is weak, nothing special, everyone knows that." The Alpha King studied her with eyes that seemed to see far more than most people revealed, his expression growing gentler as he took in her trembling hands, and the way she instinctively tried to make herself smaller in his presence. "Tell me, Omega, what do you hear when you listen to your own voice?" The question caught her off guard, so different from what she had expected that it took her a moment to process. "I hear failure," she admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. "I hear everything I'm not, everything I should be but can never become. I hear disappointment." "Interesting," King Kai mused, then gestured to his two companions. "Allow me to introduce my advisors. This is Elder Moon Whisper, keeper of the old songs and student of supernatural vocal traditions. Beside her stands Master Nightfall, who has trained the voices of royalty for over 2 centuries." Both figures stepped forward, and Luna felt her breath catch as she realized these weren't just random advisors, but legends in their own right. Elder Moon Whisper's silver hair seemed to glow with its own light, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had lived through centuries of pack history. Master Nightfall moved with the precise grace of someone whose every gesture was calculated for maximum effect, his presence radiating the kind of controlled power that could only come from absolute mastery of his craft. "We have traveled for 3 months, Elder Moon Whisper said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Luna's skin tingle with recognition, following rumors and legends, chasing whispers of a voice that could sing the old songs in their original form. Tonight, we finally found what we were seeking." "I don't understand," Luna said, looking between the 3 powerful figures who seemed to see something in her that she had never recognized in herself. "My howl is weak, everyone says so. I can barely make myself heard above the wind." Master Nightfall stepped closer, his piercing gaze studying her throat and chest with the clinical attention of a master craftsman examining a potentially valuable instrument. "Child, what you call weakness, we recognize as something infinitely more precious. You have what we call a spirit voice, a gift that appears perhaps once in 1,000 years. A spirit voice doesn't project power in the traditional sense," Elder Moon Whisper explained, her tone carrying the patience of someone accustomed to teaching complex concepts. "It doesn't dominate or command or force submission through sheer volume. Instead, it speaks directly to the soul, bypassing the ears entirely to resonate with the deepest parts of supernatural consciousness." Luna stared at them in disbelief, unable to reconcile their words with everything she had been told about herself since childhood. "But if that were true, wouldn't someone in my pack have noticed? Wouldn't they have recognized something special about my voice?" King Kai's expression darkened with something that might have been anger, though it didn't seem directed at her. "Spirit voices can only be truly heard by those who know how to listen, and your pack has clearly forgotten the old ways. They mistake volume for strength, dominance for leadership, and in doing so, they miss the most precious gifts that walk among them. Demonstrate for them," Master Nightfall suggested, his voice carrying a note of anticipation. "Show them what a true spirit voice can accomplish when properly guided." "I couldn't," Luna protested, panic rising in her chest at the thought of humiliating herself in front of royalty. "What if I disappoint you? What if I prove that everyone else has been right about me all along?" "Impossible," King Kai said with such certainty that Luna felt some of her fear begin to ease. "I have heard your voice across mountains, and through the dreams of those sensitive enough to detect such things. Trust me when I say that disappointment is not among the possible outcomes." He gestured toward the moon hanging overhead, its silver light seeming to pulse with supernatural energy. "Sing for us, Luna. Not the formal howl of pack ceremony, but something that comes from your heart. Let your voice be what it truly is instead of what others expect it to be." Luna looked around at the assembled pack members, seeing expressions that ranged from skeptical curiosity to barely concealed hostility. These people had known her all her life, had watched her fail at every attempt to prove her worth. The thought of exposing herself to potential ridicule in front of them was almost unbearable. But there was something in King Kai's eyes that gave her courage, a confidence in her abilities that she had never felt from anyone else. Slowly, hesitantly, she tilted her head back toward the moon and opened her mouth. What emerged wasn't the weak, pathetic sound her pack was accustomed to hearing. Instead, Luna found herself producing a melody that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her conscious control. It wasn't loud in the traditional sense, but it carried with a clarity and purity that made the air around them shimmer with supernatural resonance. The effect on the assembled wolves was immediate and profound. Those closest to her staggered backward as if struck by a physical force, their eyes wide with shock and something that looked remarkably like awe. Even Alpha Derek, who had ruled with unquestioned authority for over a decade, found himself taking an involuntary step back from the power that suddenly radiated from the Omega. He had dismissed as worthless, but it was the reaction of the royal party that truly stunned Luna. Elder Moon Whisper had tears streaming down her ancient cheeks. Her hands pressed to her heart as if trying to contain emotions too powerful for words. Master Nightfall stood frozen with his mouth slightly open, his legendary composure shattered by what he was witnessing. And King Kai, the most powerful werewolf in existence, slowly sank to one knee before her. "Impossible," breathed Beta Marcus, his voice barely a whisper in the sudden silence that followed Luna's song. "How is this possible? She's always been weak, always been nothing special." "Because none of you knew how to listen," King Kai replied, his voice carrying notes of reproof that made several pack members flinch. "You heard volume and mistook it for power. You heard aggression and mistook it for strength. But true power, the kind that can move mountains and change hearts, often whispers where others shout." He rose gracefully to his feet, his eyes never leaving Luna's face as he continued to speak. "What you just heard, what this remarkable young woman just shared with us, was a fragment of the first song, the melody that the moon goddess herself sang when she created our kind, the harmony that binds all supernatural beings together regardless of pack or territory or political alliance." The revelation sent shock waves through the assembled wolves, many of whom had grown up hearing legends of the first song, but never believing it was anything more than mythology. To learn that their despised Omega could access such ancient power was almost too much for their minds to process. "Your Majesty," Alpha Derek said carefully, his voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what his pack had overlooked. "We had no idea. If we had known what she was capable of, we would have trained her properly, given her the respect she deserved." King Kai's smile was sharp enough to cut stone. "Would you? Or would you have tried to control her gift, to harness it for your own purposes without understanding its true nature? The spirit voice cannot be commanded or contained, Alpha Derek. It can only be honored and protected by those wise enough to recognize its value." He turned back to Luna, who was still reeling from the discovery that her supposed weakness was actually a gift beyond price. "I have a proposition for you, young Omega. Come with me to the royal court, where you can learn to fully develop your abilities among those who understand their significance. Help me restore the old songs that have been lost to time and ignorance." The offer hung in the air like a bridge between two completely different worlds, one where Luna was valued and cherished for her unique gifts, and another where she would always be seen as a disappointment. The choice should have been easy, but the thought of leaving everything familiar behind filled her with anxiety that bordered on terror. "What about my family?" she asked quietly. "What about my pack? This is the only home I've ever known." "A home that has never appreciated your worth," King Kai replied gently. "A family that has spent 19 years convincing you that you were broken, when you were actually perfect. You owe them nothing, Luna, but you owe yourself the chance to discover what you're truly capable of becoming." As Luna stood in the moonlight, surrounded by wolves who were seeing her clearly for the first time in her life, she felt something shifting inside her chest. It was the sound of her own voice, not weak or pathetic or disappointing, but beautiful and powerful and worthy of reverence. For the first time in her life, she was ready to listen to what her heart was telling her. The decision to leave with King Kai had been easier than Luna expected, though saying goodbye to the only life she had ever known proved more difficult than she had anticipated. As their convoy traveled toward the royal capital, she found herself looking back at the Silverstone territory until the mountains disappeared into morning mist, carrying with them 19 years of memories both painful and precious. Second thoughts? King Kai asked gently, riding beside her on a horse whose midnight coat seemed to absorb starlight even in broad daylight. Over the past 3 days of travel, he had proven to be nothing like the intimidating figure she had expected. Away from the formal ceremony and political pressures, he was patient, thoughtful, and surprisingly easy to talk to. Not about leaving, Luna replied honestly, adjusting her grip on the reins of her own mount, a gentle mare that Elder Moon Whisper had selected, specifically for nervous riders. But I keep wondering if this is all some elaborate dream that I'll wake up from at any moment. 3 days ago I was the pack failure, and now I'm supposedly destined to restore ancient songs that most people think are mythology. Master Nightfall, who had been riding in contemplative silence for most of the morning, finally spoke up from his position slightly ahead of them. Doubt is natural when your entire understanding of yourself has been revolutionized overnight, but I can assure you that your abilities are very real and far more significant than you currently comprehend. He gestured toward a grove of silver birch trees that lined the road ahead, their leaves rustling despite the absence of any detectable wind. The trees respond to your presence even now, singing harmonies that only those trained in the old ways can hear. You affect the natural world in ways that most supernatural beings can only dream of achieving. Luna strained her hearing but could detect nothing unusual about the grove, just the normal sounds of leaves and branches moving in what seemed like a perfectly ordinary breeze. I don't hear anything special, she admitted, feeling a familiar stab of disappointment at her apparent limitations. Because you've spent 19 years being taught to ignore your own instincts, Elder Moon Whisper said with gentle authority. Your pack convinced you that your gifts were weaknesses, that your natural sensitivity was a flaw to be overcome rather than a treasure to be cultivated. Unlearning those lessons will take time and patience. The older woman urged her horse closer to Luna's, her ancient eyes bright with excitement that made her look decades younger. Tell me, child, have you ever experienced moments when you felt connected to something larger than yourself? Times when you sensed emotions or intentions in others without any obvious explanation? Luna hesitated, reluctant to admit to experiences that her pack had always dismissed as imagination or wishful thinking. But something about Elder Moon Whisper's encouraging expression made her decide to trust. Sometimes, during the full moon ceremonies, I could feel what other wolves were experiencing. Their joy, their pride, their sense of belonging. It was like being part of a larger song that I could hear but never join, because you were already part of something even larger, King Kai said with conviction that sent shivers down Luna's spine. The spirit voice doesn't just affect individuals. It connects to the fundamental harmony that underlies all supernatural existence. What you were feeling wasn't exclusion from your pack's song. It was awareness of the greater melody that encompasses all packs, all territories, all magical beings. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horns echoing across the valley ahead, a complex musical phrase that spoke of welcome and celebration. Luna looked up to see banners flying from towers that seemed to grow directly out of the mountainside, their colors brilliant against the clear afternoon sky. The royal stronghold, Elder Moon Whisper announced with obvious pride, home to the greatest collection of supernatural knowledge in the known world, and soon to be your new residence as well. As they approached the massive gates, Luna felt her breath catch at the sheer scale of the construction. The Silverstone pack house, which had seemed impressively large to her throughout her childhood, would have fit comfortably in the courtyard of this place. Towers reached toward the clouds like stone fingers grasping for heaven, while bridges connected impossible spans that defied every law of engineering. She thought she understood, but it was the sound that truly overwhelmed her senses. Not just the horns announcing their arrival, but a symphony of voices that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the fortress. Hundreds of supernatural beings called this place home, and their combined presence created a harmonic resonance that made Luna's mark tingle with recognition and anticipation. Welcome to Shadowspire, King Kai said as they passed through gates that were easily 50 feet tall and carved with symbols that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly. At them, the heart of the Northern Territories and the center of our efforts. To preserve the old ways in a world that increasingly values power over wisdom. The courtyard they entered was a marvel of organized chaos, with beings Luna had only heard described in stories moving about their daily business with casual efficiency. She spotted what appeared to be vampires conferring with wolf shifters, Phi courts engaging in diplomatic discussions with dragon ambassadors, and creatures she couldn't even begin to identify participating in what seemed like a massive, multi-species community. Luna Greystone called a voice from the crowd, and she turned to see a young woman approaching with a smile that managed to be both welcoming and slightly mischievous. "I'm Lyra Starweaver, Master Nightfall's assistant and your designated guide to surviving royal court politics," without accidentally insulting anyone important. Lyra appeared to be close to Luna's own age, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and barely contained laughter. She wore robes that marked her as a court musician, but her casual demeanor suggested she wasn't particularly intimidated by the formal protocols that governed life in such an elevated environment. "Is it really that complicated?" Luna asked as they dismounted and began walking toward what appeared to be the main residential tower. "Only if you overthink it," Lyra replied cheerfully. "The secret is remembering that most of the people here are more interested in your abilities than your social status. When you can sing fragments of the first song, minor breaches of etiquette become remarkably unimportant." As they climbed stairs that seemed to spiral upward far longer than the exterior of the tower should have allowed, Luna found herself bombarded with introductions to beings whose names carried the weight of legend, ancient scholars who had spent centuries studying supernatural vocal traditions, master craftsmen who created instruments capable of channeling magical energies, court musicians whose performances could influence the emotions of entire kingdoms. "Your chambers," Lyra announced, opening doors that revealed a suite larger than the entire cottage Luna had shared with her family. Back in Silverstone territory, windows looked out over valleys that stretched to the horizon, while bookshelves lined the walls with volumes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "This is too much," Luna protested, overwhelmed by the luxury and attention being lavished on someone who had been considered worthless just days before. "I don't deserve all this." "You deserve far more," came King Kai's voice from the doorway, where he stood with an expression that made Luna's heart flutter in ways she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "But we'll start with giving you a place where you can explore your gifts without judgment or limitation." He stepped into the room, moving with the fluid grace that marked all his actions, and Luna found herself acutely aware of how the afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to catch in his dark hair and illuminate the golden flecks in his eyes. "Tomorrow we begin your real training," he continued, his voice carrying notes of anticipation that suggested he was looking forward to the process as much as she was dreading it. "Elder Moon Whisper will teach you the history and theory behind spirit voices. Master Nightfall will help you develop proper breathing and projection techniques, and I will work with you on accessing the deepest levels of supernatural harmony." "And if I can't learn?" Luna asked quietly, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger with each mile. They traveled away from everything familiar. "What if I disappoint everyone here the same way I disappointed my pack?" King Kai moved closer, his presence both comforting and somehow electric in a way that made Luna's skin tingle with awareness. "Impossible," he said with such conviction that she almost believed him. "You couldn't disappoint us anymore. Then, the moon could disappoint the night by shining. You are exactly what you were meant to be, Luna. Our job is simply to help you remember that." As evening fell over Shadow Spire, and Luna found herself alone in quarters that still felt too grand for someone like her, she moved to the window and looked out over a kingdom that apparently saw her as precious, rather than worthless. For the first time in her life, she was somewhere that her voice was valued not despite its differences, but because of them. The sound that emerged from her throat as she hummed softly to herself was still quiet, still gentle, still nothing like the powerful howls that her old pack had valued. But here, in this place of ancient wisdom and careful listening, it sounded exactly right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and probably new ways to doubt herself. But tonight, for the first time in 19 years, Luna Greystone fell asleep feeling like she might actually belong somewhere. 3 months of intensive training had transformed Luna in ways that went far beyond simply learning to control her voice. Standing in the great hall of Shadow Spire before an audience that included representatives from every major supernatural kingdom, she barely resembled the trembling Omega who had arrived at the royal court believing herself to be fundamentally broken. The hall itself was a masterpiece of acoustic engineering, its soaring ceilings and carefully carved walls designed to amplify and enhance supernatural vocal performances. Tonight, it would serve as the venue for the most ambitious musical undertaking in recorded history, the complete restoration and performance of the first song, the original melody that had given birth to all supernatural life. "Are you ready?" King Kai asked softly, moving to stand beside her in the alcove where performers prepared before taking the stage. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened from professional cooperation into something that made Luna's heart race every time he looked at her with those ancient, knowing eyes, as ready as someone can be for attempting something that hasn't been done in over 1,000 years. Luna replied, though her voice carried confidence that would have been impossible just seasons ago. The extensive training with Elder Moon Whisper and Master Nightfall had taught her not just how to use her spirit voice, but how to trust it completely. The delegates are particularly excited about tonight's performance, Lyra Starweaver observed from her position near the stage entrance, where she was making final adjustments to the magical amplification crystals that would ensure Luna's voice reached every corner of the vast hall. Half of them came here expecting to witness either a miracle or a spectacular failure. "Let's make sure they get the miracle," Master Nightfall said with dry humor as he approached their small group. 3 months ago, I wasn't certain this was possible. Tonight, I'm confident that we're about to witness the restoration of magic that most scholars believed was lost forever. Elder Moon Whisper joined them, her ancient face glowing with anticipation that made her look decades younger. "The resonance crystals are all properly attuned, the acoustic enhancers are functioning perfectly, and I've never felt the supernatural harmonies more aligned than they are tonight. The very fabric of reality seems to be holding its breath in anticipation." Through the archway that led to the main hall, Luna could see the assembled dignitaries taking their seats in arrangements that spoke of careful diplomatic planning. Vampire lords sat near dragon ambassadors. Fae court representatives mingled with werewolf pack leaders, and beings whose species she was still learning to identify filled every available space. With an atmosphere of expectant tension, "Luna," King Kai said, his voice carrying undertones that made her look at him with sudden attention. "Before you take the stage, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago, but wasn't sure you were ready to hear." The serious tone in his voice made Luna's stomach flutter with anxiety. "What is it?" "The reason I was able to hear your voice across mountains, the reason I knew to seek you out specifically, wasn't just because of your spirit voice abilities," he explained, his golden eyes holding hers with intensity that made the rest of the world seem to fade away. "It was because our souls are harmonically matched. You're not just any Omega with unusual gifts, Luna. You're my destined mate, the other half of my supernatural essence." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, reordering everything she thought she understood about her situation and their growing relationship. "Destined mate," she whispered, the words carrying implications that made her head spin. "If you choose," he said quickly, raising his hands in a gesture that reminded her of their first meeting. "The harmonic resonance between us suggests compatibility, but it doesn't force choice. You have every right to reject the bond, to pursue your own path without any obligation to me or my position." Before Luna could respond, the sound of ceremonial horns announced that it was time for the performance to begin. The conversation would have to wait, but as they made their way toward the stage, Luna felt something settling into place in her chest, a rightness that had nothing to do with destiny or supernatural bonds and everything to do with the simple recognition of finding someone who saw her exactly as she was and valued every aspect of that truth. The great hall fell into absolute Silence as Luna took her position at the center of the performance space. The acoustical design meant that even the softest whisper would be audible to every person present, while the resonance crystals would amplify not just the sound, but the emotional and spiritual content of whatever she chose to sing tonight. She began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space without strain or effort. We attempt to restore something that was thought lost forever, the first song, the melody that our ancestors believed contained the fundamental harmony of supernatural existence itself. She gestured to the assembled delegates, many of whom were leaning forward in their seats with anticipation that was almost palpable. This isn't just a musical performance. If the ancient texts are correct, successfully singing the complete first song will strengthen the bonds between all supernatural species, healing divisions that have festered for centuries and restoring power that has been diminished by conflict and separation. Elder Moon Whisper moved to her designated position near the harmonic crystals, while Master Nightfall took his place at the control station for the acoustic enhancement system. King Kai remained at the edge of the performance space, his presence offering both support and something deeper that Luna was finally ready to acknowledge. Luna closed her eyes and reached for the melody that lived in the deepest parts of her supernatural consciousness. The notes came to her as naturally as breathing, each phrase unlocking memories that weren't her own, but belonged to the collective experience of all supernatural beings. The song began softly, as all the most powerful magic did, with harmonies that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the hall. But as Luna's confidence grew and her voice found its true strength, the melody expanded into something that was less performance than force of nature. The effect on the assembled audience was immediate and profound. Vampires who had spent centuries avoiding werewolf territories found themselves remembering shared ancestors and common purposes. Dragons who had considered themselves above the petty concerns of smaller beings felt their hearts opening to connections they had forgotten were possible. Phi court members discovered empathy for creatures they had always dismissed as inferior. But it was King Kai's reaction that truly moved Luna, as her voice reached the crescendo of the first song, carrying harmonies that spoke of unity and understanding across all the artificial boundaries that divided supernatural society. He stepped forward and added his own voice to hers. The harmonic resonance between them was so perfect, so complete, that the combined sounds seemed to reshape reality itself. Light began to emanate from the crystals positioned around the hall, not the cold illumination of magic, but the warm glow of life itself, responding to the restoration of its fundamental song. When the last notes finally faded and Luna opened her eyes, she found herself looking out at an audience that had been transformed by what they had witnessed. Ancient enemies were embracing. Territorial disputes were being resolved with handshakes rather than violence, and the very air seemed to shimmer with renewed harmony between beings who had forgotten how to coexist peacefully. Extraordinary, breathed the vampire lord who served as ambassador from the eastern courts. In 3 centuries of existence, I have never experienced anything that moved me so profoundly. The dragons will honor any treaty negotiated in the presence of such music, declared the massive being who represented the mountain clans. Magic this pure deserves our protection and respect. As delegate after delegate rose to offer similar commitments, Luna realized that her weak voice had accomplished something that centuries of political negotiation had failed to achieve. By embracing what made her different rather than trying to conform to others' expectations, she had found a way to heal divisions that had seemed permanent and insurmountable. "Well," King Kai said with a smile that was brilliant enough to light the entire hall, "I think we can consider tonight a success. Though I suspect this is just the beginning of what you'll accomplish once you fully embrace your gifts." He moved closer, his eyes holding hers with the intensity of someone about to make a life-changing declaration. "Luna Greystone, will you do me the honor of accepting the mate bond between us? Will you stand beside me as we work to build a world where voices like yours are treasured, rather than dismissed?" The proposal should have been terrifying, committing herself to a future she couldn't fully envision with someone whose world was so different from everything she had known. Instead, Luna felt the same sense of rightness that had guided her through the performance. the certainty that came from finally understanding her true purpose. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying across the hall with perfect clarity despite its gentle tone. "Yes to the bond, yes to the future, and yes to using our voices together to create something beautiful."